Hello and welcome back. This is tool 10 for those of you using the toolbox, Hofstede's dimensions. This is the first of two videos explaining how to do cultural scans using Hofstede's 6 dimensions framework. So in part 1, we're going to look at what the dimensions are, what we're talking about. And in part 2, we'll look at how we apply this to a cross-cultural negotiation. But for now, we begin our talk about Hofstede by talking about what we mean by business culture. And we are not interested in the best aspects of culture that you might think of. We're not interested in music or the literature or the art or the philosophy. We are interested in knowing a counterparty's attitudes, values, and priorities. We are not, and I can't repeat this strongly enough, we are not using Hofstede to predict behavior or predict outcomes. What we are using Hofstede for is to try to understand what the other side values and how we can best supply it to them. Right. So we begin with the Hofstede scan, and if you haven't done this yet, go to this website, www.hofstede-insights.com/product/compare-countries. And I have entered later, this is what it looks like. Later in part 2, we'll be using this to analyze how a German company would enter the Vietnam market. But for now, I want to start with something that is a little bit more familiar, and that is looking at the cultures of the United States and China, since they are the two cultures with the most prominent profiles in the world right now. So here's what they look like. And down along the bottom, you will see that there are 6 labels or 6 dimensions. And this is what we're measuring. We are measuring the extreme, where each country or culture lies between the extreme poles of each one of these dimensions. Power distance, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. And what I'd like to do now is just go through each one, define what the dimensions are, and look at what might be familiar to us from the way the US and China shape up. Okay, so the first thing to look at is power distance. And I've got this star because power distance and the one that follows, individualism, are the greatest predictors of conflict, in my opinion. And that is what we are most attuned to when we are planning a cross-border or a cross-cultural negotiation. Conflict kills deals. So what is PDI, or the power distance index? If we go to the Hofstede source, quoting from them, they say the power distance index is the extent to which the less powerful members of organizations and institutions, like the family, accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. In other words, how okay is it for someone with fairly low power that society is ranged in a way that there are people who have more privilege, more power, more money, simply because of circumstances beyond anyone's control? And when you're confronted with this, here are the prescriptions for you if you are dealing with a big difference between your power distance score and someone else's. First, pay attention to formality. This is where formal rituals and customs and bureaucracy come into play. Countries with high PDIs, high power distance indexes, feel that it's okay for there to be a lot of regulations, or it's just normal for there to be a lot of rituals. And if you're from a low power distance index country, you might feel that it's okay to question this stuff. Don't. If you're trying to go from low to high, if you're trying to do business with someone who's got a higher power distance index, let them take on the role of host or expert and find ways to solve problems collaboratively instead of announcing your solutions. Things like flat organizational charts, casual Fridays, and lone wolf cowboy types may annoy them. And this means that on your side, you've got to manage your millennials who sometimes have trouble showing respect for things. The next one is also a big one. This might even be bigger. And this is individualism versus collectivism. And you can see China is a very collectivist place. They've got an extremely low individualist score of 20. And the United States is extremely individualist with a 91. And the definition of an individualist score is the degree to which people in a society are integrated into groups. You can see that the United States is not particularly group-oriented, whereas China is extremely group-oriented. And the prescription, what you have to do in order to bridge this gap is, this is where the in-group and out-group analysis come in. So if you're in the out-group, and you probably are, then you have to spend a lot of time building those relationships. And the thing that you might not automatically guess about collectivists is, you think that if you're growing up in groups and if you're organized in groups, then it'll be very easy to group up with you, with that person. But it might not be so. Collectivists feel that they've already got all the connections they need and that they are constantly being presented with more connections than they know what to do with. So your job is to do something that they're not used to doing, which is to self-introduce. If you can get someone else to introduce you, someone they already know, that's the best way. But as an outsider, you may not have that. So you may have to use existing channels like the chambers of commerce or alumni associations. But if you do get a chance to meet with people, it may be in a social scenario first, in a banquet or some other social event. Well, be aware that a collectivist will use this as due diligence. He's on the job. As an individualist, you might see these cocktail parties as just etiquette, just prelude before the real negotiation begins. But to a collectivist, the social event is part of the negotiation. And next up is masculine versus feminine. And note that China and the United States are pretty similar. In a minute, we'll be looking at a case where they're not so similar. Masculine feminine, or the MAS index, measures if masculinity is defined as a preference in society for achievement, heroism, assertiveness, and material rewards for success. The counterpart of this, the femaleness, femininity, is a preference for cooperation, modesty, caring for the weak, and quality of life. Yes, it's unfortunate that they chose to name it this, but it is an important set of attributes to examine. So if you live to work, if you define yourself by your job, you've got a masculine orientation. Your values and identity are tied to the job, you're success-oriented, and you're very competitive. If you are feminine, then you work in order to live. And your values, your identity are probably based on things outside of your job. You might be more family-oriented or more artistically or aesthetically oriented, and you might not be that engaged in your job. All right. The next one, now in the bottom half, the next one is uncertainty avoidance. And again, both the United States and China come in a little bit on the low side of this. So we're going to avoid talking about the conflicts here for them, but we will see it later. And here's how the Hofstede has defined this. Societies that score a high degree in this index, the uncertainty avoidance index, opt for stiff codes of behavior, guidelines, laws, and there's a general belief that there's one truth for everyone and that everyone knows what it is. So you can see the United States is kind of high on this. China's low on this. China is not known for its strict adherence to institutions. And that is sometimes at odds with its high power distance. But we'll see, and we'll see that later. That is a tension that always exists within the Chinese culture. And it's something you have to be aware of. So the prescription here, if you're trying to deal with, if you have a low uncertainty avoidance index and you're trying to deal with someone who has a higher, position yourself as the safe option. Don't appear too aggressive or you'll be labeled as arrogant. And in Asia, in China in particular, but in Asia in general, arrogant is a nice way of saying that you're not a suitable partner. In the case of China, the relatively low uncertainty avoidance index, it is a counter to the high power distance index we saw earlier. So don't be too quick to attribute any particular behavior to one dimension. You've got to look at them all as a package. Long-term orientation is a big difference here. It's important, but it's not what you think. Long-term orientation versus short-term orientation here talks about traditions versus a pragmatic view of the future. Traditional view of the past versus pragmatic view of the future. The one that's patience or restraint is the next one. So here is what Hofstede has to say about long-term orientation. This dimension associates the connection of the past with the current and future actions and challenges. A low degree, and here I'm looking at you, United States, a low degree in this index indicates that traditions are honored and kept, while steadfastness is valued. Okay, and that's what the low one looks like. China has a high one. Societies with a high degree in this index view adaptation and circumstantial pragmatic problem solving as a necessity. So another way to look at this is people with a high score try to fit in with the future. People with a low score tend to fight the future. Low score is I'm not changing. That's not the way my father did it or the way his father did it. High score says good and bad may change over time. Survival and success are all that count. And finally, we'll wrap up with indulgence. Low score in indulgence indicates that you have restraint. High score, you don't have restraint and you are indulgent. So here's what the Hofstedes had to say about the IND index. This dimension is essentially a measure of happiness, whether or not simple joys are fulfilled. Indulgent societies, the US, believe themselves to be in control of their own lives and emotions. Restrained societies believe other factors dictate their life and emotions. Okay, thanks very much. That wraps up part one. What do the different dimensions mean? In the next episode, we will look at a case of a German doing business with Vietnam. Thanks very much. I'll talk to you in a minute.